fire and defiance across 3 millennia. This is the story of Elam. From the shadow of the Zagros Mountains, a forgotten power forged a legacy that outlived its destruction. Discover how this Persian precursor built magnificent ziggurats, challenged mighty empires, and controlled trade routes connecting worlds. Follow their journey from first cities to devastating conquest, where even Assyria's brutal annihilation couldn't erase their cultural DNA. Though their capital burned in 646 BC, their language, art, and architecture silently shaped the Persian Empire that followed. Experience how a vanquished civilization became the invisible foundation of greatness. At the edge of the world known to the ancients, the Zagros Mountains rose like a fortress of stone. Their ridges glimmered with snow even in summer. Their valleys stretched wide and green, and from their slopes poured waters that carved the plains into life. Dawn struck the peaks first, and only later did the lowlands wake, smoke lifting from hearths, animals stirring in their pens, voices rising in the cool air. Out of these valleys, Elam was born. On the plain, Susa grew into a city of clay and fire. Its walls rose pale against the horizon, its streets alive with barter and prayer. Merchants crowded the gates with donkeys laden with oil, grain, and hides, while temple servants carried baskets of offerings to the shrines of their gods. In Shushinak, guardian of Susa, received the first and the best, bowls of food, cups of wine, the blood of sheep poured out on altars beneath the open sky. From dawn to dusk, chants wound upward in the air, as steady as the toll of hammers on clay. Far to the east, in the highland valleys, Anshan took shape. Its position made it less a market than a citadel, perched among passes where mountain trails converged. Houses clung to the slopes, and great walls marked the power of those who ruled there. From this seat, the highland lords looked down on caravans that wound through the ridges, claiming their share of copper from mines, timber from forests, and stone hewn from quarries. Anshan grew larger with each passing generation, until it rivaled the might of Susa itself. Together, they became twin thrones, one in the plain, one in the hills, balancing each other in a pattern that endured for centuries. Trade bound these places to the wider world. Long lines of beasts carried barley and wool into the mountains, and returned with turquoise that glimmered blue as the heavens. Caravans pressed eastward too, where the cities of the Indus offered ivory, carnelian, and polished shells in exchange for silver. Markets swelled with voices from distant lands, words slipping across tongues that could not always understand one another, but found agreement in the weight of a measure or the gleam of a jewel. Susa became a place where strangers haggled side by side, where foreign fabrics touched Elamite wool, where the scents of spices mingled in the air like smoke on the wind. Within households, power was not always sealed by the father's hand alone. Daughters carried inheritance, sisters bestowed legitimacy, and queens stood as the bloodline through which dynasties claimed their rule. Men rode to war, yet it was often the women of their houses who ensured the right to reign, binding families together as firmly as mortar-bound bricks. A throne might rest on bronze swords and high walls, but it also rested on the name of a mother. As prosperity deepened, ambition spread. By 3100 BC, leaders pushed their reach outward across the Iranian plateau. Watchtowers crowned ridges that once belonged only to shepherds, and fortified posts rose along caravan roads. Tribute flowed inward from far places, swelling the storehouses of Anshan and Susa. Grain piled high, jars of oil stood stacked in rows, and timber beams from distant forests stretched across the ceilings of new halls. The land of Elam no longer survived on what the fields alone could yield. It reached into distant valleys, grasping whatever its people could draw into their grasp. Water, however, remained the true measure of power. The sky was fickle, sometimes generous with rain, sometimes cruel with drought. Rather than wait on chance, the Elamites cut through the earth itself. They tunneled into the mountainsides until underground rivers bled into channels of stone and clay. These qanats brought hidden waters to the surface, feeding crops even in the hottest seasons. Fields of barley rippled gold against the wind, where once there had been only dust. To command water was to command life, and Elam learned to master both. Their devotion wove ties stronger than any rampart. Beneath sacred groves, men and women whispered prayers as the branches stirred overhead. On hillsides, fires burned on altars of clay, their smoke rising to the gods who watched from the stars. Pinakir, radiant among the constellations, was called upon for blessings. Inshushinak, lord of Susa, ruled not only over the living, but also over the dead. Their names were woven into every vow, every treaty, every act of rule. The gods were not distant abstractions. They were companions at birth, guardians in battle, and judges at the final breath. Death itself mirrored life's order. Rulers went to their graves with bronze blades, seals carved with images of lions and kings, and vessels filled with food for the road beyond. Common folk were buried with beads, combs, and small jars of oil. Each grave, whether lavish or modest, carried tokens of a belief that no life ended with the closing of the eyes, but continued in a journey that only the gods could guide. Signs of identity were everywhere. Men and women pressed small cylinders into wet clay, rolling out scenes of battles, hunts, and divine encounters. These seals, worn on cords around the neck, marked ownership, sealed agreements, and spoke for their bearers even in silence. To leave such a mark was to claim a place in the order of the world, to say, "This is mine, this is known, this will endure." By the end of the 3rd millennium, BC, Elam had stepped firmly into history. Villages had swelled into cities, markets hummed with voices from distant lands, gods had temples and groves, and rulers commanded with both sword and seal. Against the backdrop of Mesopotamia's great powers, the land of the highlands stood apart, neither imitator nor shadow, but its own creation. Nothing yet was carved in great stone steles. No epics yet thundered with the names of its kings. But in the press of markets, in the chant of prayers beneath sacred trees, and in the flicker of torchlight on mud-brick walls, Elam had already found its heartbeat. The kingdom of the mountains was awake, and it would endure. On the wide Susiana plain, where rivers meandered through fields of barley, a city rose that would become the pride of the highlands. Susa gleamed against the horizon like a jewel set in clay, its walls tall and pale, its gates busy with the press of traders and farmers. The air was thick with dust and incense, with the lowing of oxen and the calls of merchants hawking wares beneath the sun. This was no longer a cluster of huts huddled around a shrine. Susa had become a world unto itself, the first great city of Elam. The city's heart beat in its temples. Pilgrims entered courtyards where columns of mud brick stood as tall as trees, their walls painted in red and black, their altars bright with fire. Here, the goddess Pinakir was honored, a radiant figure linked with the stars themselves. By her side stood Inshushinak, guardian of Susa, whose name carried the weight of judgment over both the living and the dead. Worshippers brought baskets filled with grain, jugs of wine, and sacrifices of sheep or goat. Drums echoed through the courtyards. Flutes carried high notes across the rooftops, and the smell of burnt offerings mingled with the sweetness of date wine poured out in libation. Religion was not a ceremony for a chosen few. It was the thread that bound the city's days, marking the rhythm of sowing, harvest, birth, and burial. Around these temples rose the palaces of the lords, courtyards paved with clay tiles opened into chambers, where rulers received envoys and merchants alike. Columns painted with bright pigments supported ceilings draped with woven mats, while bronze lamps cast warm light over the faces of men, deciding the fate of the land. Here, kings and priests ruled together, their authority wrapped in the mantle of divine favor. Each decision, whether about trade or war, was spoken not only in the name of men, but also in the name of Inshushinak, the protector of the city. Markets stretched beyond the palaces, spilling into the streets. Donkeys staggered under loads of lapis lazuli, its blue shining like captured sky, brought from far Badakhshan to the east. Copper ingots gleamed against the sun. Wool dyed in colors from local plants lay folded beside woven mats, while jars of fragrant oil stood ready for sale. Caravans arriving from Mesopotamia carried textiles and fine pottery, and returned with timber from Elamite forests and silver mined in the hills. The plain of Susa had become a bridge between worlds, between the great cities of the Tigris and Euphrates, the mountains of Iran, and the distant Indus Valley far to the east. The city's growth demanded protection. Walls encircled its heart, rising in concentric rings that gave Susa a fortress-like aspect. At night, torches flickered along the ramparts, where watchmen looked out over the fields toward the Zagros in the distance. The construction of these defenses was more than practical. It was a statement. Susa was not a village vulnerable to raids, but a power in its own right, a city whose walls promised endurance. Beyond the walls, towers marked the skyline, while gates opened onto wide roads where carts creaked and children ran barefoot in the dust. Within those walls, not all men and women lived alike. Graves unearthed near the city reveal the lines of its society. In some, bodies were laid with golden ornaments, weapons of bronze, and drinking vessels of carved stone. Others held only simple jars of clay, or a few beads strung together on a cord. The division of wealth and rank was sharp, and Susa bore it openly. Yet even in the simplest graves, offerings were present, a reminder that every soul, lord or servant, stood before the gods in death. The people of Susa found ways to mark themselves in life as well. They carved tiny seals, cylinders no longer than a finger, engraved with lions, mountains, gods, and men. Rolled across wet clay, these seals left scenes as vivid as any tale. A hunter loosing an arrow, a priest raising his hands in prayer, a goddess standing among stars. A seal was a man's name, his mark, his authority. In storerooms where jars were counted and contracts agreed upon, the press of a seal meant more than words. It was proof, identity, and legacy. The city did not merely defend itself with walls and signatures. It prepared for war in new ways. Bowyers shaped wood and horn into composite bows, weapons that hurled arrows with strength and accuracy unknown before. Warriors carried them into battle, their shots whistling across plains, their power magnified by the skill of those who wielded them. In the hills beyond Susa, men tested chariots built for speed over rough ground, their wheels turning swift beneath armed riders. Elam had begun to shape warfare in forms that would echo far beyond its valleys. Daily life carried on beneath the shadow of these great structures. Children played in courtyards, throwing pebbles and chasing one another through the alleys. Women spun wool into threads, weaving bright patterns into cloth that would dress both commoners and nobles. Men returned from the fields with baskets of barley, or drove herds of goats bleating through the gates at dusk. Music rose from reed flutes in the evenings, mingling with the rhythm of drums beaten with open palms. The scent of bread baking on clay ovens filled the air, while fires crackled in hearths as families gathered to share food and story. Susa was not alone on the plain. Villages surrounded the city, their lives tied to its fortunes. Farmers brought their harvest into its markets. Craftsmen delivered their goods, and in return, the city offered protection, trade, and the presence of gods whose temples promised favor. The countryside and the city lived as one, the plain sustaining the city, and the city giving purpose to the plain. Not all who walked its streets spoke the same tongue. Alongside the Elamite voices came the words of Sumer, carried by traders and scribes from the west. In clay tablets baked hard by fire, contracts and letters were sometimes written in both languages, proof that Susa stood at a crossroads not only of goods, but of ideas. Mesopotamian myths mixed with Elamite prayers, Sumerian cuneiform stood beside local symbols, and in this meeting, the culture of Elam grew richer, borrowing without being consumed. Festivals marked the city's rhythm, seasons turning with songs and sacrifices. At the start of the year, processions wound through streets, banners waving in the air, musicians leading the way to the temples. Priests poured wine on the altars. Women sang hymns to Pinakir, and the people of Susa gathered to share food in open courtyards. In such moments, the city became more than stone and clay. It became a single body, breathing and moving as one under the gaze of its gods. As the centuries passed, Susa's name carried weight far beyond the plain. Kings of Sumer looked east and knew that to challenge Elam was to risk armies drawn from both mountain and valley. Diplomats came to its palaces, bringing gifts to secure peace or alliances. Rulers of neighboring lands recorded the name of Susa in their inscriptions, acknowledging its power. It was no longer a frontier town nor a trading outpost. It had become a capital, the beating heart of a kingdom whose pulse reached across mountains, deserts, and rivers. By 2200 BC, Susa stood as more than a city. It was a statement carved into earth and brick, a declaration that Elam had taken its place among the great powers of the age. Its temples echoed with the names of gods who would be remembered for centuries. Its walls still bore the marks of hands that shaped them against time. Its markets, its palaces, its shrines, all proclaimed the same truth. This was Elam's first great city, and through its gates passed the future of Persia before Persia. In the lands west of the Zagros, the cities of Sumer stood crowded along the rivers, like beads strung on a necklace of mud and reeds. Each was a power in its own right, boasting high temples and armies that clashed as often with each other as with their neighbors. Beyond their fertile fields lay Elam, rising in the highlands like a watchful neighbor, sometimes ally, sometimes adversary, always present. The two peoples could no more ignore one another than day could ignore night. The earliest tales of their encounters were written in Sumerian script, carved into tablets that named both kings and enemies. One such name was Enmebarajesi of Kish, remembered as one of the first rulers to lead an army eastward against the highlands. His march was not the last. The Sumerians looked to the mountains for stone and timber, for wealth and captives, and for the glory of subduing the untamed lands beyond their river valleys. The Elamites, for their part, resisted with a tenacity born of rough terrain and proud independence. From these first clashes was born one of the earliest recorded wars in human history. Such rivalry grew fiercer as power shifted in Mesopotamia. When Sargon of Akkad forged his empire in the 24th century BC, Elam lay in his path. Sargon's armies pressed eastward, determined to secure the frontier and break the independence of the highlands. Yet the Zagros valleys were not easy to conquer. Villages fortified themselves against the invader. Mountain passes closed, as if the earth itself resisted, and Elamite fighters harried the Akkadians with ambushes and swift raids. Though Sargon claimed victories, he could not extinguish Elam's strength. From time to time, there were truces. Naram Sin, grandson of Sargon, made peace with the Elamites in a treaty that became one of the first formal agreements between states. It bound the highland rulers to his empire in name, yet it also acknowledged their autonomy. To carve such an agreement into clay was more than political convenience. It was the recognition that Elam was not a land to be broken and absorbed, but a power to be reckoned with. This custom of diplomacy, once begun, would echo through Persian history in centuries to come. The two cultures mingled as well as fought. Scribes in Susa began using cuneiform alongside their own symbols, adapting Mesopotamian writing into Elamite service. Myths and images crossed borders. Mesopotamian heroes appeared on Elamite seals, while motifs of the mountains slipped into Sumerian art. In the markets of Susa, Akkadian merchants bargained in the same stalls where Elamite traders weighed copper and tin. On the battlefield they met as enemies, but in daily life their worlds intertwined. Elamite warriors earned a reputation far beyond their homeland. Mesopotamian kings hired them as mercenaries, drawn by their skill with bow and axe, their endurance on long marches, and their ability to fight in terrain where lowland soldiers faltered. These men carried with them not only weapons, but customs, shaping the way Sumerian armies fought. Chariots adapted for rough ground and archery tactics suited for ambush bore the mark of Elamite influence. Even as their lands clashed, their methods seeped into one another, like dye into cloth. These wars were not fought solely with swords and bows. Conquerors on both sides learned the power of terror and exile. When cities fell, captives were marched from their homes to new lands, their absence weakening old communities and their presence bolstering new settlements. Centuries before the Assyrians made deportation infamous, the practice was already written in Elam's story, a weapon as devastating as fire or steel. Families torn from their valleys carried their gods, their songs, and their grudges into foreign soil, ensuring that the memory of conflict lingered long after the battles had ended. Among the kings who rose during these centuries was Puzur in Shushinak, remembered in Elam as a leader who sought more than survival. He dreamed of uniting the highlands and the lowlands into a single realm. For a brief moment, he seemed to succeed. From his throne, he commanded armies that struck deep into Mesopotamia, toppling cities and carrying their treasures back to Susa. His victories announced to the world that Elam was no longer content to defend itself. It could also conquer. Though his realm did not endure beyond his lifetime, the memory of his ambition would inspire future rulers who sought once more to challenge the powers of the rivers. The balance between Elam and Sumer swung back and forth with the generations. One year, the Akkadians boasted of victories carved into stone steles. Another year, Elamite raiders swept across the plains, burning temples and carrying off captives. Neither side could claim final triumph. Each remained too strong, too stubborn, too deeply rooted in its own land. They were locked together in a rivalry that forged both strength and identity, sharpening them as whetstones sharpen blades. By 2100 BC, the great Akkadian Empire had faltered, collapsing beneath the weight of invasion and rebellion. In its ruins, Sumerian city-states struggled to rise again, and Elam found new room to breathe. The Highland lords reasserted their independence, rebuilding their towns, restoring their gods, and preparing for the next chapter in their long duel with the West. Out of the smoke of wars, Elam endured, scarred yet unbroken. It had learned much in these centuries, how to fight as both defender and aggressor, how to balance war with diplomacy, how to borrow from neighbors without losing itself. In the clash of rivers and mountains, Elam defined itself, neither swallowed by Mesopotamia nor isolated from it. Theirs was a relationship of blows and embraces, of treaties signed and temples sacked, of blood spilled and customs shared. And so the rivalry lingered like an unending storm. The Sumerians looked east and saw the mountains waiting, defiant as ever. The Elamites looked west and saw the plains, tempting, dangerous, never to be ignored. Between them lay the fragile space of treaties and trade, always threatened, never lasting. Theirs was not a story of victory and defeat, but of endurance, of two worlds locked in struggle that would shape the fate of both for centuries to come. Across the valleys of Elam, a new name began to carry weight: the Lords of Awan. Their dynasty rose in an age when Mesopotamia faltered, when the Akkadian Empire cracked under strain, and the Gutian tribes swept across the plains. Out of that chaos, Elamite rulers seized the chance to build something lasting. From their highland strongholds, they reached outward, binding towns and valleys into the first kingdom known by name in their history. The Awan kings ruled from both Anshan and Susa, balancing the twin hearts of their land. Their authority stretched across the Iranian plateau, binding mountain and plain through loyalty sworn, tribute delivered, and blood spilled in war. For the first time, Elam appeared not as scattered cities and clans, but as a dynasty recorded in the annals of its neighbors. Sumerian inscriptions spoke their names, sometimes as rivals, sometimes as allies, always as powers to be reckoned with. Among these rulers, none shone brighter than Puzur in Shushinak. His ambition exceeded the narrow valleys of his homeland. He dreamed of a kingdom unified, powerful enough to rival any on the plains. With armies drawn from highland fortresses, he struck deep into Mesopotamia, seizing towns, carrying treasures, and carving his triumphs into stone. To the Sumerians, his name became a shadow that loomed eastward, a reminder that the mountains were not passive lands to be plundered, but sources of power that could strike in turn. Puzur and Shushinak also left a mark beyond war. Under his hand, the scribes of Elam cast aside Mesopotamian cuneiform and turned once more to their own tongue. The linear Elamite script appeared in this age, brief but brilliant, written in bold signs unlike any other. Its symbols spoke directly in the language of the highlands, proclaiming independence from the cultures of the rivers. For a generation, the walls of Susa bore inscriptions not in Akkadian, not in Sumerian, but in Elamite words carved for Elamite ears. Though the script would fade, replaced again by cuneiform, it revealed the pride of a people determined to speak in their own voice. Life under the Awan kings was more than glittering halls and clashing armies. Excavations of their cities reveal streets laid with order, courtyards where officials weighed tribute, storerooms stacked with jars of oil and grain. These were not temporary camps, but planned settlements, marked by the hand of rulers who understood administration as well as conquest. The wealth of the highlands flowed into their centers: copper from mines, timber from forests, stone from quarries. From these resources, they raised walls, temples, and houses that declared Elamite strength to all who passed their gates. The dynasty also oversaw a society where power rested on a dual throne. Susa and Anshan balanced one another, each a capital in its own right, each representing a different face of the kingdom. The lowland city tied Elam to trade with Mesopotamia, its gates opening onto the plains. The highland seat commanded the passes and valleys, ensuring control over routes that reached deep into the Iranian plateau. Together, they formed a system that kept Elam stable, a model that future dynasties would inherit and adapt. Power for the Awan kings was not confined within their realm. Mesopotamian records recall them forging treaties and binding alliances through marriage. Alliances bound them to Sumerian dynasties, sometimes in friendship, sometimes in wary cooperation. A marriage might bring peace for a season, but peace rarely lasted. The lure of fertile plains and rich cities drew Elamite armies westward time and again, while Mesopotamian kings dreamed of pushing their banners into the highlands. When the Gutians swept into Mesopotamia after the fall of Akkad, Elam stood at the edge of the storm. Sometimes the highlanders fought alongside these raiders, striking towns already weakened by invasion. At other times, they clashed with them, defending their own valleys from Gutian incursions. In this age of shifting powers, the Awan kings proved resilient, able to bend when needed, to strike when opportunity came, and to survive when empires collapsed around them. Life under their rule followed rhythms both familiar and new. Farmers still bent over fields of barley and wheat, their labor feeding the cities. Shepherds drove herds across slopes where watchtowers guarded passes. Artisans in Susa carved seals of stone and ivory, each impression marking identity and authority. But above these daily labors, a new layer of order pressed down. The authority of kings who claimed dominion not only over their own households, but over valleys and provinces beyond. Taxes were gathered, tribute demanded, and soldiers conscripted into armies that marched under banners of Awan. Colonies also spread, Elamite influence far from the core. Settlements appeared on the coast near Bushehr, where the waters of the Persian Gulf met the land. Others rose in Kerman, linking highland resources to the kingdom. These outposts extended Elam's reach and secured its trade, ensuring that the dynasty's power did not rest solely on its two capitals, but radiated outward across the plateau. The achievements of individual rulers filled this age with stories. Some held power long enough to leave inscriptions naming their works. Others lived only in the records of enemies, mentioned as foes defeated in campaigns. Yet together they formed the first line of kings, whose dynasty carried continuity across generations. This was not the rule of a single conqueror, but of a family that maintained authority through succession, inheritance, and tradition. In their reigns lay the beginning of dynastic Elamite history. Still, their power was not unchallenged. As Mesopotamia recovered from the Gutian storm, new city-states rose again in strength. Conflict returned with the same ferocity as before. Wars burned across the borderlands, victories and defeats recorded in rival chronicles. The Awan dynasty endured these struggles for 2 centuries, adapting, resisting, and surviving. But like all things, their time eventually waned. By 2000 BC, their line faltered, giving way to a new power rising in the highlands. The kings of Shimashki. The memory of the Awan kings, however, lingered. They had proven that Elam could stand not as scattered towns, but as a kingdom. They had shown that Susa and Anshan together could form the twin pillars of a state. They had dared to write their language on their own terms, to rule with independence, to expand across valleys and coasts. They stood at the dawn of Elamite kingship, and their shadow stretched forward across centuries. For those who came after, their dynasty became both foundation and warning. It revealed the heights Elam could reach when united, and the fragility of that unity when tested by time. Their walls may crumble, and their names may fade, but the pattern they set endured. The pattern of a land that would never again be merely a frontier, but always a kingdom with a voice of its own. Smoke drifted across the plains of Mesopotamia in the early years of the second millennium BC. Once proud cities of the third dynasty trembled beneath pressures from all directions. Amorite tribes pressing in from the west, mountain peoples from the east, and restive subjects within. Into this turbulent world stepped the rulers of Shimashki, a dynasty born in the valleys and passes of Elam, who seized the chance to carve their names into history. Shimashki lay in the highlands beyond Anshan, a region of rugged terrain where clans gathered strength in scattered fortresses. From those ridges came war bands eager for plunder and power. One by one, ambitious lords bound these bands together until their confederation grew into a dynasty capable of challenging Mesopotamian kings. Their power did not rest on a single capital alone, but spread across multiple centers, each ruled by princes who pledged loyalty to the dynasty's leading king. This loose but resilient structure gave them flexibility where their rivals grew rigid. At the head of this rising power stood Kindatu, remembered as the conqueror who struck the final blow against the last king of Ur. He allied himself with Amorite leaders from the west, joining forces with men who had long raided the fertile valleys. Together, they pressed upon the walls of Ur, that ancient city of ziggurats and hymns, until its gates fell. The year was 2004 BC, and with the fall of Ibisin, the last king of Ur, the Sumerian Renaissance collapsed into ruin. Ur's capture burned itself into memory. Chronicles lamented the destruction in lines heavy with grief, describing temples desecrated, families scattered, and treasures carried off to distant lands. Ibisin himself was taken in chains to Anshan, where he lived out his days in captivity, a broken remnant of Suma's glory. To the Elamites, it was triumph, the proof that their highland confederation could topple one of the great powers of the age. To the Sumerians, it was tragedy, sung in laments that mourned not only a city, but an entire order of the world. Behind the clash of kings lay deeper motives. The southern trade routes that wound toward the Persian Gulf offered wealth too great to ignore. Whoever held them controlled the flow of copper, timber, and stone that moved northward into Mesopotamia. By striking Ur, the Shimashki kings seized access to these lifelines. What appeared to be vengeance or ambition was also strategy, control of commerce, command of the roads, mastery of the wealth that sustained kingdoms. Under Shimashki authority, the old Elamite customs endured. Power still passed through matrilineal lines, and marriages bound the dynasty not only within itself, but with Mesopotamian houses. Daughters of Elamite lords wed Amorite princes. Mesopotamian brides crossed into highland courts. Such unions tied bloodlines together, cementing alliances that no treaty alone could secure. In their households, women held authority over estates and inheritance, while their names appeared in records beside those of their husbands and brothers. The dynasty's strength rested not only on royal courts, but also on its confederate structure. Multiple rulers governed different regions, each contributing warriors and tribute when called upon. This system allowed Shimashki to draw upon diverse resources without overextending a single city. It also bred rivalries, for no king could forget that his power depended on the loyalty of other lords who might shift allegiance with changing fortunes. Yet for nearly a century, the dynasty maintained cohesion enough to keep Elam strong. Stories of conquest spread across the lands. Raiders from Shimashki struck deep into Mesopotamian heartlands, returning with caravans of captives and plunder. Villages emptied as their people were marched eastward into Elamite valleys, where they built, farmed, and served under foreign lords. At the same time, Elamite settlers moved west, establishing footholds in lands once ruled from Population shifted like sand in a storm, reshaping the map with every campaign. Even so, the Shimashki rulers were more than destroyers. They invested in their homeland, strengthening towns and fortresses, overseeing irrigation and trade. New routes connected their highlands with the Gulf Coast, ensuring that goods from distant lands flowed through Elamite hands. The dynasty's vision stretched beyond raiding. They sought to sustain dominion by building systems that endured after battles ended. Amid these changes, religion continued to knit society together. In Shushanak's temples in Susa received offerings brought from far-off conquests. Gods of Mesopotamia were honored as well, carried eastward by captives who prayed to them in strange tongues. Shrines in Elam bore dedications to both local and foreign deities, a reflection of a society that absorbed as much as it conquered. Faith was not erased by conquest. It was blended, layered, and reimagined. Ur's fall left scars that endured for generations. Sumerian poets composed laments that compared the city's fate to a storm sweeping across the land. They wrote of walls torn down, of fields left desolate, of temples reduced to ash. These laments carried sorrow across centuries, ensuring that the Elamites would forever be remembered in Mesopotamian memory as the destroyers of Ur. Yet within Elam itself, those same events were remembered as the moment their strength was proven, when the mountains humbled the rivers. As the years passed, the Shimashki dynasty weathered new challenges. Amorite powers, once allies, grew into rivals as they established kingdoms of their own across Mesopotamia. Tribes that had once stood beside Elam in battle now contested the same lands. The confederation strained under these pressures, its balance of power tested by shifting loyalties. Still, for a century, it endured, a testament to the resilience of Elamite rule. By the end of the dynasty's reign, a new house was rising. The Sukalma, who would inherit Elam's mantle and reshape its politics. Yet the Shimashki era remained unforgettable. It was they who toppled they who marched Ibisin into exile, they who demonstrated that Elam could not only resist but dominate its neighbors. In their story lies the transformation of Elam from frontier raiders into a dynasty whose deeds echoed in laments, treaties, and memories for centuries. What remained after them was not only ruin, but precedent. They showed that alliances could topple empires, that trade routes were as precious as temples, that kingship could rest on a confederation rather than a single throne. They carved their legacy in the ashes of leaving behind both grief and inspiration. From their hands, the torch of Elamite power passed to new rulers, but the fire they kindled would burn long into the ages. When the kings of Shimashki faded into memory, a new order rose from Susa. The dynasty that followed called its rulers Sukalma, Grand Regents, a title unlike that of any other court. It marked a break with the past, a system where power did not sit in one pair of hands, but in a layered hierarchy: overlord, co-ruler, and governor. Together, they ruled as a triad, binding Elam into a structure that was at once complex and enduring. For 4 centuries, this system guided the highland realm, balancing ambition with cooperation. At the summit stood the Sukalma himself, master of Susa and Anshan, who held sway over the kingdom's armies and wealth. Below him ruled the Sukal of Elam, a co-regent who shared authority and often served as heir. Beneath them governed the Sukal of Susa, entrusted with the capital's daily administration. Power, succession, and duty flowed not in a single line, but in branches, ensuring continuity even when fate struck down one ruler. Brothers could rule beside one another. Sisters could secure inheritance through marriage, and the dynasty endured through shared blood and shared responsibility. From their palaces, these rulers extended Elam's reach further than ever before. Envoys carried their seals to Babylon, Mari, and Assyria, bearing letters that survive even now in clay archives. Their tone was confident, their demands bold. In the palace of Zimri-Lim at Mari, scribes recorded dozens of letters from Elamite kings, speaking of alliances, trade agreements, and wars fought together or apart. Rarely had Elam's voice carried so strongly across Mesopotamia. Siwepala Kupak, one of the most formidable Sukalmas, built this web of diplomacy into a system that some would later call federal. He bound regional rulers into confederation, demanding loyalty but granting them autonomy. His ambition stretched wide. From the highland valleys of Iran to the great cities of Mesopotamia, his influence pressed outward like ripples on water. At the height of his power, Babylon itself felt his hand. This age was not only one of kings and treaties, it was also a time when law took root more deeply in Elamite soil. Clay tablets from Susa describe contracts, disputes, and judgments rendered under a system distinct from that of their Mesopotamian neighbors. Where Hammurabi in Babylon carved his laws into stone for all to see, Elamite judges relied on precedent, oaths, and the presence of gods as witnesses. Women could appear in these records as landowners, merchants, or lenders, their property protected, their rights acknowledged in transactions beside those of men. Such customs, shaped by centuries of matrilineal succession, made Elam a land where women's authority carried weight both in palace and marketplace. Scenes of daily life unfolded beneath this legal order. In workshops of Susa, smiths hammered bronze into blades, helmets, and ornaments. The style they perfected would influence the bronzes of Luristan centuries later, their designs spreading far beyond Elam's borders. Potters turned clay into jars stamped with seals that declared ownership. Merchants packed goods onto caravans bound for the Persian Gulf, where Elamite outposts controlled the trade of lapis, copper, and ivory. Farmers, meanwhile, bent over furrows, irrigating their fields with channels that carried water drawn from rivers or hidden qanats beneath the soil. These deeds were tied to heaven by religion, within Shushinak, reigning as Susa's patron and keeper of the afterlife's justice. Temples rose with courtyards broad enough to hold hundreds, where worshippers gathered during festivals. Priests and priestesses oversaw rituals, offering sacrifices of sheep, goats, and birds, their chants echoing off painted walls. Yet Elamite religion never demanded uniformity. Alongside their native gods, they honored deities from other lands, building shrines for Mesopotamian figures when they entered Elamite life. This tolerance allowed many peoples to dwell under the Sukalma's rule without abandoning their traditions. In Susa, diplomacy began at the threshold of the gods, where envoys passed through temple gates and sealed their words with sacred oaths. A treaty was not merely words scratched into clay. It was a covenant sealed by divine witness. To break it risked not only political reprisal, but spiritual damnation. For this reason, Elamite diplomacy carried a weight that neighboring rulers respected and feared. Wars, however, remained inevitable. The Sukalmas clashed with Babylonia and Assyria, their armies marching westward in long columns. Warriors carried composite bows, spears, and bronze axes, shields slung across their shoulders as they marched to the rhythm of drums. Siege engines creaked against enemy walls, while flaming missiles arced through the sky. Victories brought plunder, golden vessels from Babylon, herds of cattle, and captives who swelled Elamite towns. Defeats, too, came, but the system of shared rule allowed Elam to recover more swiftly than kingdoms tied to a single throne. In coastal lands, Elamite influence deepened. Colonies sprang up along the Persian Gulf, commanding harbors where ships from distant shores arrived with goods. Timber from Arabia, pearls from its waters, and exotic animals passed through Elamite hands. These colonies strengthened both wealth and prestige, giving the Sukalmas dominion not only over land, but over seaborne trade. Within the palaces of Susa, the dynasty displayed its grandeur. Courtyards paved with tiles led to reception halls decorated with colored plasters and carved reliefs. Banquets filled these halls on festival days. Nobles reclined on couches, musicians played lyres and drums, dancers moved to the rhythm of flutes. Cups of wine circulated, poured from jars glazed with bright patterns. Amid this splendor, scribes recorded contracts, marriages, and decrees, pressing seals into clay to preserve the order of the kingdom. Behind the glitter of court life, succession required careful balance. Brothers sometimes ruled together, sisters married into powerful houses, and disputes flared when ambition outstripped tradition. Yet the system of layered authority prevented collapse. Even when a Sukalma died, his co-regent could step forward, his authority already established. This stability allowed the dynasty to endure for centuries, longer than many of its rivals to the west. Foreign rulers, too, recognized Elam's durability. Babylonian kings sent envoys with gifts to secure alliances. Assyrian lords weighed carefully whether to fight or negotiate. The archives of Mari, filled with letters exchanged with Elam, reveal a kingdom deeply enmeshed in the politics of its age. Rarely did a great decision in Mesopotamia occur without Elamite involvement, whether as ally, adversary, or broker of peace. The age of the Sukalmas saw artisans push their skills to new brilliance, adorning precious metals with stones of every hue. Artisans cast statues of bronze that depicted both human figures and animals sacred to Elamite faith. Textile workers wove garments of wool dyed in bright colors, traded as far as the cities of the Levant. These works traveled with caravans, spreading the fame of Elam's artistry beyond its borders. Ordinary people lived their lives beneath the shadow of this grandeur. Farmers sowed fields with barley and wheat, harvesting with sickles of bronze. Shepherds guided flocks along the ridges of the Zagros. Fishermen cast nets into rivers that shimmered in the sunlight. Children played in courtyards, chasing dogs or shaping clay into small figurines. At night, families gathered around hearths, listening to elders recount stories of kings, gods, and battles long past. Centuries passed under the rule of the Sukalmas, and still their system endured. Dynasties elsewhere rose and fell, their capitals burned, their names forgotten. Yet in Elam, the structure of overlord, co-ruler, and governor held steady, adapting to change, absorbing shocks, and passing authority from one generation to the next. This resilience gave Elam its longest age of stability thus far, and allowed its culture to flourish in ways that would shape the centuries to come. When at last their line came to an end, around 1500 BC, the Sukalmas left behind more than monuments or inscriptions. They left a model of governance that balanced ambition with order, family with state, and religion with law. Their rule had carried Elam into the heart of Mesopotamian politics, secured its influence on the Persian Gulf, and fostered a culture where women could inherit, artisans could thrive, and merchants could prosper. In their centuries of dominion, the Sukalmas transformed Elam from a kingdom of warriors into a federation of power, one that would be remembered long after its towers crumbled into clay. In the centuries after the Sukalmas had secured Elam's stability, the balance of power in Mesopotamia shifted once again. Far to the west, on the banks of the Euphrates, Babylon rose from a modest city to a kingdom whose ambitions matched the greatest empires of the past. Its ruler was Hammurabi, a man whose name would echo through ages, remembered not only for conquest, but for the laws he carved into stone. Against him stood Elam, no longer the confederation of raiders from earlier days, but a kingdom hardened by centuries of rule. When these two powers met, the clash shook the lands between mountains and rivers. Hammurabi inherited a realm hemmed in by rivals. Assyria to the north, Mari to the west, and Elam to the east. He was cautious at first, building alliances, striking only when advantage was certain. In those years, Elam often stood as both threat and bargaining chip in Mesopotamian politics. Its armies could tip the balance in wars among the lowland kings, and its rulers used that leverage well. From Susa came envoys carrying demands, promises, and veiled threats, their seals pressed into clay alongside those of Babylonia's scribes. For a time, Babylon and Elam coexisted uneasily. Letters from the archives of Mari reveal negotiations where Elamite rulers bargained for trade privileges and military support, while Babylon weighed whether friendship or enmity better served its purposes. Zimri-Lim of Mari often found himself caught between the two, seeking to mediate, fearing to provoke either. Such diplomacy held for a generation, but beneath the surface the current of rivalry grew stronger. Elamite armies still carried the weight of their highland heritage. Warriors marched with bows of wood and horn, shields slung across their backs, axes glinting in the sun. Chariots rumbled along plains, their wheels reinforced to withstand rough ground. Commanders relied on swift raids and sudden strikes, tactics learned from mountain warfare, which often confounded lowland armies used to set-piece battles. Yet Hammurabi was a master of adaptation. He studied his enemies, learned their methods, and forged an army disciplined enough to meet Elamite ferocity head-on. The decisive clash came in 1764 BC. Hammurabi allied with Mari against Rimzin of Larsa, who had called on Elamite aid. Elamite warriors crossed the Tigris to join Rimsin's forces, confident that their strength would once again tip the balance of Mesopotamian struggles. But Hammurabi struck with precision. At the battle that followed, Babylonian troops broke the coalition, scattering Rimsin's forces and driving the Elamites back across the frontier. For the first time in generations, Babylon had bested Elam, not through negotiation, but on the open field of war. Accounts speak of siege engines battering against walls, of rivers diverted to flood enemy positions, of trade routes cut until cities starved. Hammurabi understood that war was not fought only with weapons, but with control of resources. Grain shipments were blocked, caravans intercepted, and Elam found itself strangled not by defeat in battle alone, but by economic pressure. Villages that once traded freely across the plains now hesitated, fearing Babylonian reprisal. Wealth that had flowed into Susa began to dry, and discontent murmured among those who had long relied on such trade. Still, Elam was not crushed. Defeat on the battlefield forced its rulers to retreat into their highland strongholds, but from there they endured, as they always had. Babylon could dominate the plains, But the mountains remained stubborn. Armies that ventured too far into the Zagros found themselves harried by ambushes, their supply lines severed, their victories fleeting. Hammurabi may have won glory, but Elam remained unbowed in its heartland. Diplomacy resumed, sharper than before. Babylon demanded submission, Elam insisted on independence, and neighboring kingdoms maneuvered between them. Refugees fled back and forth, some from Babylon seeking shelter in the highlands, others from Elam driven west by famine or fear. Entire families crossed borders with only what they could carry, swelling the population of towns unprepared for such arrivals. The movement of people, as much as the clash of armies, defined this age. In Susa, rulers sought to preserve strength by turning inward. They reinforced city walls, repaired canals, and gathered craftsmen to sustain the economy, even as trade faltered. Legal traditions continued to evolve, distinct from Hammurabi's famous code, where the Babylonian king inscribed precise penalties into stone. Elamite law often remained rooted in custom, administered through local judges who weighed cases with the gods as witnesses. Compensation payments, inheritance rights, and contracts recorded in both Elamite and Akkadian show a society determined to endure regardless of external pressure. Faith remained a shield of resilience and belonging. When Inshushinnak's festivals came, Susa overflowed with chants and parades that bound the city to its guardian deity. Rituals for Pinakir, radiant goddess of the stars, reminded the people that their destiny was tied not only to earthly kings, but to eternal powers. Even in the shadow of Babylonian triumphs, Elamite priests proclaimed that their gods still watched over them, that no foreign ruler could sever that bond. Unexpected channels carried culture across borders. Babylonian captives bore Elamite ways with them, just as Mesopotamian prisoners brought their customs into Elam's valleys. Stories, songs, and designs passed along with them. Pottery styles blended, religious symbols crossed borders, and new words crept into both languages. Even in war, peoples mingled, leaving behind legacies more enduring than treaties or campaigns. Elam's survival depended not only on endurance, but on adaptation. Highland lords reorganized their confederation, shifting alliances and emphasizing autonomy for local rulers who could defend their own valleys. This decentralization allowed Elam to survive repeated Babylonian offensives. When Hammurabi died in 1750 BC, his successors inherited a strong empire, but also the burden of containing a neighbor who refused to vanish. Elam re-emerged from its retreats, reclaiming trade routes, forging new alliances, and proving that no single defeat could erase centuries of resilience. The rivalry left marks on both sides. Babylon remembered Elam as a dangerous neighbor, capable of sudden violence and persistent defiance. Elam remembered Babylon as a rival too powerful to ignore, yet never strong enough to annihilate. Between them stretched a frontier alive with watchtowers, fortified towns, and restless armies. For generations, this border would remain a place of tension, shaping both kingdoms' destinies. Daily life carried on amid the uncertainty of war. Farmers still sowed barley in fields watered by ancient khanats. Traders still led caravans across mountain passes, though they now traveled with heavier escorts. Artisans continued to carve seals, their cylinders rolling out scenes of gods, kings, and battles, perhaps reflecting the turmoil of their times. In homes of mud brick and reed, families whispered prayers for peace, while preparing their sons for the inevitability of war. What Hammurabi's victory ensured was not Elam's destruction, but Babylon's supremacy over Mesopotamia. For the first time, the rivers were united under one crown, and Elam stood as the outsider, forced to contend with a neighbor stronger than any before. Yet the highlands had taught endurance. Generations of Elamites knew that plains kings came and went, empires rose and fell, but the mountains remained. From those slopes, Elam would rise again, as it had so many times before. Thus ended an age not of conquest, but of collision. Babylon, under Hammurabi, secured dominance, carving his laws and victories into stone for all to see. Elam, scarred but unbroken, retreated into its strongholds, biding its time until fortune shifted once more. Between them lay a landscape of ruined cities, disrupted trade, mingled peoples, and lessons hard learned. It was a struggle without final victory, a contest of endurance that would continue as long as rivers flowed west of the Zagros, and men dreamed of empires across the plains. Storms of war had swept across the Near East for centuries, yet Elam endured. After Hammurabi's Babylon rose and fell, after dynasties rose from ashes only to crumble again, the highland realm gathered itself for a new chapter. From Anshan and Susa came rulers who reshaped the kingdom once more, launching what historians later called the Middle Elamite period. This was an age of renewal, when Elamite kings expanded their reach, raised temples that still astonish, and bound their gods and people in tighter bonds than before. From the start, the new dynasty ruled with a vigor that set it apart. Kings took titles that emphasized dominion not only over Elam, but over the highlands and lowlands together. Their proclamations spoke of divine favor and earthly conquest in equal measure. Inshushinak remained the guardian of Susa, but other deities too gained prominence, their temples rising across the land. Through stone and brick, these kings announced their authority, claiming both heaven's sanction and the right to command men. Expansion marked their ambition. Armies marched into the Iranian plateau, establishing control over valleys and fortresses that had once stood beyond their grasp. Settlements multiplied, swelling into towns with walls, marketplaces, and temples. Population grew, sustained by irrigation systems that spread water further than ever before. Canals cut across the land like veins, feeding fields of barley, wheat, and dates. In the highlands, herds of cattle and flocks of goats grazed on slopes claimed in the king's name. Strength also demanded rivalry. To the west, Kassite Babylon held sway, a dynasty that had endured for centuries. Relations with the Kassites alternated between wary peace and open conflict. Treaties were signed, marriages arranged, but armies too crossed the border in pursuit of advantage. Elamite kings raided Kassite lands, seizing captives and treasures. In turn, Kassite forces struck back, burning towns and challenging Elamite fortresses. The struggle between highland and lowland was never resolved, but it hardened both, ensuring that neither could rest easy. Inshushinak's temple at Susa became the beating heart of this new age. Kings poured resources into its construction, raising walls higher, decorating them with glazed bricks that caught the sunlight in dazzling colors. Courtyards stretched wide, filled with worshippers during festivals. Priests offered sacrifices, while musicians played drums and flutes, their sounds echoing against painted walls. Smoke rose from altars, carrying the scent of burning flesh and incense to the sky. In such ceremonies, rulers declared themselves chosen by the gods, protectors of a realm both sacred and earthly. This was a time when royal ideology deepened, and kings styled themselves as caretakers of their people, preservers of balance and blessed of the divine. In inscriptions, they listed victories in war, donations to temples, and blessings received from the gods. Their words sought not only to record, but to proclaim, to shape memory itself. By presenting themselves as both conquerors and pious servants, they wove a story of legitimacy that reached every corner of their realm. With their patronage, metalwork reached new heights, bronze smiths crafting arms of unmatched durability and elegance. Swords, axes, and spearheads left their forges with designs that combined deadly function with intricate decoration. Armor, too, was fashioned, offering protection that earlier warriors could only dream of. These advances did more than serve armies. They influenced cultures far beyond Elam, feeding into the artistic traditions of Luristan and beyond. The achievements of the age were preserved by Elamite scribes in many languages, with documents written in Elamite, Akkadian, and Sumerian, centuries beyond the fall of Sumer's last ruler. Such multilingualism reflected both pragmatism and pride. It allowed rulers to communicate with neighbors while preserving their own tongue. In these records lie glimpses of an administration sophisticated enough to govern a realm that spanned mountains, plains, and trade routes stretching from the Indus to Mesopotamia. Stories of Gilgamesh and other Mesopotamian heroes also found their way into Elamite circles, yet they did not remain unchanged. Elamite versions adjusted tales to their own sensibilities, weaving foreign myths into local traditions. In this way, culture was not imported but adapted, reshaped to suit the people of the highlands. Literature, art, and religion merged into a tapestry that was unmistakably Elamite, even when its threads came from abroad. This era saw horses rise in prominence, breeding programs shaping animals fit for battle's speed and travel's endurance. Cavalry units added new speed to Elamite armies, while chariots became symbols of power displayed in parades as well as on battlefields. Their presence altered warfare, giving kings the ability to strike with sudden force across plains once thought too vast to control. Urban life thrived. Susa swelled with workshops, markets, and neighborhoods crowded with families. Anshan too grew, its highland terraces filled with houses, granaries, and temples. Craftsmen plied their trades, jewelers setting lapis into gold ornaments, weavers producing cloth dyed in brilliant colors, potters shaping jars painted with swirling patterns. In every alley, the hum of work mingled with the cries of merchants and the laughter of children. The visibility of women endured, with inheritance and ownership still theirs, and their role in succession as firm as before. Records speak of women managing estates, lending silver, and participating in trade. In royal households, queens influenced alliances through marriage and diplomacy. On estates, wives and daughters carried responsibility for maintaining family wealth. The Elamite kingdom, unlike many of its neighbors, recognized women as integral to its order. Tolerance helped hold this expanding realm together. Conquered peoples were not forced to abandon their gods. Shrines rose to foreign deities beside Elamite temples, a recognition that loyalty could be secured without erasure. Such policies reduced rebellion and encouraged cultural exchange. Within Elam's cities, voices spoke many languages, but all lived under the authority of the Sukalma's successors. In the countryside, life moved to older rhythms. Farmers guided oxen pulling plows, their bodies bent beneath the sun. Herdsmen tended flocks that grazed the mountain slopes. Hunters stalked gazelles across the plains, bringing fresh meat to markets. Festivals drew villagers into the cities, where they joined in sacrifices and processions, strengthening the bond between ruler and people. Though the dynasty sought to shape a grand vision of empire, its roots still lay in the labor of those who sowed, reaped, and carried goods to market. The rivalry with Kassite Babylon defined much of this period. Battles raged along borders, armies clashing in valleys and across rivers. Some campaigns ended with Elamite triumphs, their warriors carrying off sacred statues and treasures. Others ended in defeat, their towns sacked and temples looted. Neither side gained lasting supremacy, but the struggle honed both into hardened powers. Their fates were bound together, enemies who could not escape one another's shadow. By 1100 BC, the Middle Elamite kingdom stood as a force to be reckoned with. Its armies had expanded its reach, its temples proclaimed divine favor, its cities thrived with artisans and merchants. The dynasty had lasted centuries, longer than many of its rivals, weaving stability and ambition into a legacy that would shape the centuries ahead. And yet, beneath the surface, the seeds of decline had already been sown. Climate shifts, internal tensions, and renewed pressures from Mesopotamia would soon strain the kingdom's strength. For now, however, Elam stood proud, its kings proclaiming dominion from mountain to sea, its gods honored in temples that glimmered beneath the sun, its people bound together in a realm that had proven, again and again, its resilience against the tides of history. South of Susa, where the rivers of Khuzestan curved through fertile soil, a king dreamed of raising a city unlike any that had stood before. His name was Untash-Napirisha, and he ruled Elam during a time when power was measured not only in conquests, but in monuments that bound people and gods together. From his vision came Chogar-Zanbil, a sacred city crowned by a ziggurat that rose tier upon tier, climbing toward the heavens. The project began with foundations cut into the earth. Workers hauled bricks of mud and baked clay, stacking them in endless rows. Each bore an inscription stamped into its surface, naming the king who commanded its making. Thousands upon thousands of bricks carried his words, ensuring that no wall or step of the ziggurat could exist without bearing his mark. From dawn until dusk, the clang of tools rang out. The shouts of overseers echoed, and the city of Untash-Napirisha began to take form. At its center rose the great ziggurat, dedicated to Inshushinak and Napirisha, gods who stood as pillars of Elamite faith. Step by step, the structure climbed higher, 5 terraces stacked one atop another, each faced with gleaming brick. Glazed tiles of turquoise and deep cobalt shimmered in the sunlight, their colors a reflection of both earth and sky. From afar, the ziggurat must have appeared as a mountain built by human hands, a sacred ladder between the mortal world and the realm of the divine. Around the ziggurat spread the sacred city itself. Streets stretched outward in careful order, lined with temples to Elamite gods and foreign deities alike. Shrines to Pinakir, goddess of the stars, stood beside sanctuaries for gods imported from Mesopotamia, a testament to Elam's openness. Priests walked these avenues in solemn procession, their chants rising with the smell of incense. Worshippers gathered in courtyards, bowing before altars, where sacrifices of sheep, wine, and bread were laid out in ritual offerings. Water gave life to this holy city. Engineers dug channels that diverted streams into reservoirs, filling pools and cisterns. In an age when drought could ruin kingdoms, Chogar-Zanbil boasted a system that ensured abundance. Pilgrims arrived and found water flowing at their feet, a marvel they would remember as a sign of divine blessing. The city's irrigation channels shimmered in the sun, glinting like silver veins through the brown earth. Kilns glowed red-hot as bricks were baked by the thousands. Potters shaped jars to store offerings, their sides painted with symbols of stars and animals sacred to the gods. Bronze workers forged vessels for the temple altars, their surfaces polished until they gleamed like gold. Artisans glazed bricks in colors rare for the age, setting them into patterns that decorated walls with bands of blue, green, and white. Chogar Zanbil became not only a place of worship, but a gallery of Elamite skill. Inscriptions carved by Untash Napirisha declared his devotion to the gods and his intention to create a city that would outlast him. He called on both Elamite and Mesopotamian deities, ensuring that no worshipper, whether native or foreign, would feel excluded. His project was both political and spiritual. By gathering the gods together, he bound his realm's diverse peoples beneath a single sacred center. Pilgrims from across the land journeyed there, bringing offerings and loyalty to the king who had built a new home for the divine. The ziggurat's terraces became the stage for grand ceremonies. Processions climbed its steps, priests carrying statues of the gods, singers chanting hymns, and drummers beating rhythms that echoed across the plain. At the summit, sacrifices were offered, the smoke rising high above the city. From miles away, shepherds in the fields could see the smoke and know that prayers were being carried upward, linking earth to sky. The sight of the great ziggurat reminded all who looked upon it that Elam's kings were chosen not only to rule men, but to serve the gods. Even so, the project was never finished. Though the ziggurat still towers, evidence suggests its construction halted before completion. Perhaps the king's death ended his vision, or perhaps the strain on resources proved too great. The reasons remain hidden, but the city as it stands speaks of ambition cut short. Chogar Zanbil, vast and magnificent, became a monument to both human devotion and human limitation. Despite its incomplete state, the sacred city endured as a center of worship. Pilgrims continued to arrive, priests continued their rituals, and the walls stood firm against the centuries. Even after Untash Napirisha was gone, his city remained a living testament to his reign, a place where the gods still received prayers and offerings, long after his body had returned to dust. Beyond the city, Elamite expansion continued. Armies marched into Mesopotamia, pressing against Kassite Babylon and Assyrian towns. Campaigns carried Elamite banners across valleys, and victories brought home statues, treasures, and captives. Some of these spoils were placed in Chogar Zanbil's temples as offerings, proof that the gods favored Elam's conquests. War and religion intertwined. Victories on the battlefield were celebrated with ceremonies at the ziggurat, binding divine favor to earthly triumph. Daily life in the sacred city carried on in quieter tones. Children ran through courtyards, their laughter echoing off temple walls. Merchants set up stalls outside the sacred precinct, selling bread, dates, and trinkets to visiting pilgrims. Women spun wool in shaded courtyards, their hands working threads that would become garments for priests. Farmers brought grain from surrounding fields, their carts rattling through city gates, their offerings poured into storehouses destined for temple rituals. Among the innovations of the city were its glazed bricks, some of the earliest of their kind. Shards found within its ruins reveal a mastery of color and technique that would later influence Persian architecture at Susa and Persepolis. Brilliant blues and greens decorated the walls, shining even after centuries of sun and rain. These were not mere building materials. They were symbols of glory, crafted to ensure that the gods themselves would find pleasure in their dwelling place. Though Untash Napirisha sought to unite his realm through faith, he could not escape the pressures of politics and war. Rivals in Mesopotamia looked eastward with suspicion, and Elamite expansion drew the envy of neighbors. Alliances shifted, battles erupted, and victories alternated with defeats. Even so, the existence of Chogar Zanbil projected a message. Elam was not only a land of warriors and raiders, but a kingdom capable of building monuments to rival the greatest cities of the age. In time, later rulers looked upon his work with both reverence and practicality. Some added to the city, others neglected it, but none erased it. The ziggurat remained, towering above the plain, a visible sign of the Middle Elamite dynasty's ambition. Travelers who saw it carried stories of its grandeur far across the land, spreading Elam's fame in ways armies alone could not achieve. As centuries passed, Choga Zanbil became woven into memory. Its terraces, its temples, its colors, all proclaimed the vision of a king who sought to gather gods and men in one sacred city. Even incomplete, it stood as one of the greatest architectural achievements of its age, surpassing many rivals in scale and ambition. Untashnapirisha's name survived not because of conquests alone, but because he dared to dream in brick and clay, to shape faith and politics into walls that touched the sky. When his reign ended and his successors turned their eyes once more to war, the city remained, silent but enduring. Its towers watched the seasons turn. Its shrines echoed with prayers long after their builder was gone. To this day, Choga Zanbil whispers of an age when Elam reached for heaven, when kings bound gods and people together in a vision carved from mud brick and faith. Summer winds blew across the plains of Mesopotamia, carrying dust over the walls of Babylon. For centuries, Kassite kings had ruled there, patient and enduring, their dynasty surviving longer than any that had come before. Yet from the east, beyond the Zagros, a new threat stirred. Elamite kings, heirs of Untashnapirisha's sacred vision, gathered their armies and set their sights on Babylon itself. What followed would be remembered as one of Elam's greatest triumphs. Shutruk Nahunta led the charge. His banners rose over columns of warriors armed with bronze-tipped spears and bows strung from horn and sinew. Chariots rattled across the plains, their wheels reinforced with metal, carrying archers who loosed volleys into enemy ranks. Step by step, his army pressed westward, cutting through towns and fortresses that had long guarded Babylon's approaches. Villages surrendered or burned. Temples fell silent as idols were carried off to Susa. By 1158 BC, the march reached its climax. Babylon's gates, once symbols of endurance, opened to Elamite forces. Shutruk Nahunta entered the city not as a guest or ally, but as conqueror. His soldiers spread through its streets, prying treasures from temples and palaces, seizing monuments carved by dynasties long dead. Among the spoils were objects that had stood as symbols of Mesopotamian greatness for centuries: the victory stele of Naram Sin, Hammurabi's great law code, and the sacred statue of Marduk himself. Each was borne eastward, placed in the temples of Susa, as proof that Elam now held the heart of the lowlands in its grasp. The procession of plunder must have astonished all who saw it. Monuments that once towered in Babylon now stood in foreign halls. Inscriptions were added in Elamite, declaring the triumph of new masters. To the Babylonians, this was humiliation. To the Elamites, it was vindication, a sign that centuries of rivalry had ended in their favor. Babylon, long a thorn in their side, now lay beneath their feet. Shutruk Nahunta did not reign alone. His sons, Kutir Nahunta and Shilhak in Shushinak, joined him in campaigns that carried Elamite banners deeper into Mesopotamia. Together they ruled as conquerors, dividing responsibilities, reinforcing victories, and ensuring that Babylon's submission was no passing moment. Cities of the Diyala region fell beneath their armies. Fortresses toppled, and tribute poured into Elamite hands. The dynasty seemed destined to carve an empire that would rival Sargon's of old. In Susa, celebrations honored both gods and kings. Temples filled with treasures carried from Babylon, offerings laid before Inshushinak and Napirisha as thanks for divine favor. Priests led processions through crowded streets, chanting hymns that praised both deities and the human hands that had delivered victory. Citizens feasted on meat and wine, their voices raised in songs that recalled battles fought and cities taken. For a time, Elam basked in glory, its rulers hailed as lords not only of mountains, but of rivers. Everyday life reflected the influx of wealth. Artisans shaped new works from the gold and silver seized in conquest. Jewelers reset gemstones looted from Mesopotamian treasuries, giving them Elamite patterns. Scribes copied inscriptions onto tablets, recording both the victories of their kings and the spoils taken from Babylon. Merchants thrived as trade routes reopened under Elamite control, their caravans laden with goods bound for distant markets. Even farmers felt the change, as royal granaries filled with grain, levied as tribute from conquered towns. Yet triumph carried its dangers. Babylon's defeat was not the end of its story. Humiliation hardened its will, and neighboring powers eyed Elam with suspicion. Assyria, always watchful, grew wary of a highland kingdom that could march into Babylon itself. Within Elam, success bred rivalries among brothers and heirs. The very victories that lifted the dynasty also sowed the seeds of future conflict. Still, for decades, the glory endured. Shilhak in Shushinak, in particular, added to his father's triumphs. He strengthened Elam's control of captured lands, expanded temples in Susa, and commissioned inscriptions that celebrated his reign. His campaigns carried him deep into Mesopotamia, striking fear into cities that once dismissed Elam as a mountain frontier. Wherever his armies went, they left behind a trail of broken walls and offerings carried eastward. The memory of this era clung to both victors and vanquished. In Babylon, laments were sung of the time when Marduk's statue was carried away, when the heart of the city seemed to beat no more. In Elam, songs of triumph proclaimed that their gods had proven stronger, their kings more favored. These stories shaped how each people remembered the other. For the Babylonians, Elam became the destroyer. For the Elamites, they had finally humbled the lowlands. In the streets of Susa, children grew up beneath monuments their ancestors had not built. They looked on Hammurabi's stele and Naram Sin's victory stone not as foreign trophies, but as part of their own heritage, absorbed into Elamite tradition. Sacred and secular blended in those halls, as plundered objects took on new meanings in the service of new masters. The triumphs of Shutruk Nahunte and his sons reached further than their lifetimes. They proved that Elam, so often underestimated, could dominate Mesopotamia when opportunity aligned. Their victories secured wealth, prestige, and a place in the chronicles of kings. Even centuries later, Babylonian texts remembered the sack with bitterness, while Elamite inscriptions recalled it with pride. By the mid-12th century BC, however, the tide began to turn. Babylon recovered, alliances shifted, and Assyria grew stronger. Elam's hold on the conquered lands weakened, and its kings found themselves defending what they had gained rather than pressing further. Still, the memory of their triumph remained untarnished in Elamite hearts. For a generation, they had ruled not only their highlands, but the very city that symbolized Mesopotamian greatness. The story of this age closes not with Elam's fall, but with its glory intact. Shutruk Nahunte and his sons carved their place in history through fire and conquest, carrying away the heart of Babylon and planting it in the temples of Susa. though the triumph could not last forever, its echo endured, a reminder that mountain kings could descend upon the plains and rewrite the fate of nations. Autumn winds swept across Susa's walls, carrying with them a silence that had not been heard in generations. Where once processions filled the streets with drums and hymns, the sound now echoed thinly, as if the city itself held its breath. The age of Shutruk-Nahunta and his triumphant sons had passed, and with it the confidence that Elam could march westward at will. In its place came uncertainty, as power ebbed away and new storms gathered from beyond the Tigris. Victories that had filled the temples with plunder began to fade into memory. Treasures from Babylon still stood in courtyards. Inscriptions still proclaimed past triumphs, but the energy that had built them was gone. Internal rivalries split the royal house, brothers and cousins quarreling over succession, their disputes whispered in palace halls and shouted in city squares. Elam's strength, once magnified by unity, now weakened as factions jostled for the throne. Beyond the city gates, the land itself grew cruel. Droughts struck with persistence, rivers shrank, and the canals that had once sustained harvests cracked under the sun. Farmers abandoned fields that no longer gave enough to feed their families. Herdsmen led their goats higher into the hills in search of pasture, while villages on the plains shrank into silence. Hunger gnawed at the edges of stability, and rebellion simmered in households where men cursed their rulers and prayed for rain. Assyria sensed weakness. Rising once more in northern Mesopotamia, its kings rebuilt armies, disciplined and relentless. Iron weapons gleamed in their ranks, harder and sharper than the bronze Elam's smiths had long relied upon. With iron-tipped spears and arrows, Assyrian soldiers cut through enemies who once resisted them. Their campaigns carried them down the Tigris, and Elam's borderlands became targets for raids and intimidation. Villages near the frontier bore the brunt. Smoke rose from homesteads put to the torch. Families fled into the hills, and survivors told of Assyrian soldiers marching with relentless precision. Captives were driven westward in chains, leaving behind empty lands. Fear spread quickly. Towns fortified themselves as best they could, walls patched with whatever stone or timber could be found, but no defense seemed high enough to stop the growing power from the north. Inside Elam, the great cities still stood, but their confidence faltered. Susa endured, its temples tended, its ziggurat looming above the plain, yet the crowds that once filled its markets thinned. Anshan, perched in the mountains, remained fortress and refuge, but its influence no longer extended as it once had. The delicate balance between highland and lowland, which had sustained Elam for centuries, began to tilt under strain. Darkness fell, not only on the land, but on memory itself. Fewer inscriptions were carved, fewer records left behind. Where once kings proclaimed victories and piety in stone, now silence stretched across decades. Archaeologists centuries later would call this the Elamite Dark Age, but for those who lived it, it was simply hardship without glory, endurance without triumph. Forgetting itself seemed to settle over the land, as though kings had nothing left worth carving into brick. New peoples pressed in from the east. From the Iranian plateau came waves of tribes, Persians and Medes among them, who slipped into valleys once held firmly by Elamite lords. They did not yet command kingdoms, but their presence shifted the balance. Elam, long the bridge between Mesopotamia and the highlands, now found itself sharing that space with newcomers, eager for their own share of the fertile plains. In Shushinak's temple at Susa still smoked with offerings, though fewer in number. Families carried jars of grain, wine, or oil to shrines. whispering prayers for rain, for harvest, for protection from raiders. Priests kept ancient rites alive, chanting hymns remembered from better days. In mountain hamlets, villagers gathered around sacred groves, leaving bread, fruit, or small animals at the roots of trees. Faith endured where politics faltered, binding communities together when kings and armies could not. Among the hills, life returned to older rhythms. Villages shrank, towns emptied, and pastoralism spread where irrigated fields once stood. Men drove flocks from valley to valley, moving with the seasons. Women tended small plots near springs, weaving wool into cloth, while children chased each other through dust and thorn. Wealth once measured in silver, and monuments gave way to survival measured in milk, grain, and the health of herds. Assyria's shadow lengthened with every decade. Kings in Nineveh and Ashur wrote of victories over Elam, boasting of tribute carried off and enemies destroyed. Their armies pressed against the Zagros, testing Elam's defenses again and again. Tales spread of Assyrian brutality. Fields burned, captives flayed, rebels impaled outside their own gates. Even when Elam escaped invasion, the fear of such horrors weighed heavy. In Susa, memories of past triumphs still lingered. Children played in courtyards where Hammurabi's stele stood, long since stripped of Babylonian pride and claimed as Elamite treasure. Elders told stories of the time when Shutruk-Nahunta had carried Marduk's statue away, reminding listeners that their ancestors had once humbled Babylon itself. Even in weakness, the people remembered, and that memory of greatness gave them reason to endure. Generations passed under this long twilight. Kings rose and fell, some remembered only by a single name, others barely recorded at all. Each tried to hold the line against Assyria, each sought to preserve independence, but none restored the glory of earlier ages. Still, the line of rulers did not end. The kingdom clung to life through centuries of hardship, held together by faith, memory, and stubborn resilience. By 900 BC, Elam emerged from this dark century battered but alive. It had lost territories, seen its people scattered, endured both drought and invasion. Yet Susa still stood, its temples still served, its kings still claimed authority. The highland valleys still sheltered villages loyal to Elam, and the memory of resilience remained. Survival itself was victory, and survival laid the foundation for resurgence. The centuries of hardship had not broken Elam. They had tempered it, preparing the kingdom for the revival soon to come. Smoke from cooking fires drifted lazily above the valleys of Anshan, where villagers gathered in the evening light. Men returned from herding, women spun wool beside the hearth. Children laughed as they chased each other between clay houses. For generations, this rhythm had carried on with little hope of change. Then, slowly, the mood shifted. Whispers passed through market squares. New kings in Susa, new armies on the march, new banners rising above the hills. After centuries of hardship, Elam was stirring again. The rulers who came to power in this era did not inherit a realm of abundance. They faced scattered towns, weary farmers, and the looming threat of Assyria. Yet they brought energy, ambition, and a determination to restore their land's pride. Dynasties rose one after another, not always smoothly, not always without blood, but together they revived Elamite identity and carried their banners back onto the stage of Near Eastern politics. Armies formed once more, drilled in the valleys and marshaled in the plains. Men armed with iron-tipped spears and bows stood in ranks, their shields catching the morning sun. Cavalry units rode beside them, mounted on horses bred for endurance as well as speed. Elamite chariots, lighter than those of their western neighbors, maneuvered swiftly over rough terrain. Commanders tested their forces against Assyrian raiders, learning how to counter iron with strategy, ambush with patience, and cruelty with resilience. Susa once again became a capital that mattered. Its temples were repaired, its palaces filled with scribes, and its markets bustled with merchants carrying goods from the Gulf and the plateau. Caravans arrived with lapis and turquoise, others with wool and grain, still others with incense from Arabia. Languages mingled in its streets: Elamite, Akkadian, Aramaic, even early Old Persian. After the silence of the Dark Age, Susa's voice rang loudly once more. Rulers of this period forged alliances that tested Assyria's dominance. Babylon, chafing under Assyrian pressure, found a willing partner in Elam. Treaties were sworn with oaths before gods of both lands. Marriages bound dynasties together, and armies joined to challenge the might of Nineveh. In these campaigns, Elamite warriors once again crossed the Tigris, fighting not as raiders, but as allies in great coalitions. Their archers were valued for their deadly accuracy, their cavalry for speed, their commanders for cunning. One such ruler, Humban Nikash, revitalized Elam's prestige by striking at Assyria's allies and forcing them to reckon with the Highland Kingdom. His successors, including Shutruk Nahunta II, built on his momentum. Though their fortunes rose and fell with battles won and lost, the impression was clear. Elam was no longer silent. It had returned as a force capable of shaping the destinies of its neighbors. The resurgence touched every corner of life. In workshops, metal workers hammered iron alongside bronze, producing tools and weapons more durable than before. Potters experimented with new forms, their jars painted in swirling patterns that carried echoes of ancient traditions, but revealed fresh creativity. Farmers restored old irrigation canals, coaxing grain from land long neglected. Merchants reopened trade routes toward Central Asia, carrying textiles and metals to distant markets. The hum of industry, absent for so long, returned. Faith, too, thrived in this revival. Temples to Inshushinak were repaired and expanded. Festivals once again drew crowds, filling streets with processions of priests, musicians, and worshippers bearing offerings. Sacred fires blazed at night, their glow visible for miles across the plain. Gods of conquered peoples were welcomed as well, their shrines built beside Elamite sanctuaries. This inclusiveness gave the kingdom a resilience that pure force never could. Diversity became strength, binding highlanders, lowlanders, and foreigners into a realm that honored many gods but served one crown. Along the Gulf Coast, Elamite influence deepened. Ports swelled with ships carrying cargo from Dilmun and beyond. Sailors brought tales of distant lands, of copper islands and pearl waters. Taxes and tariffs enriched the royal treasury, funding armies and monuments alike. The Gulf became a highway of wealth, and Elamite hands controlled many of its tolls. Assyria, of course, did not sit idle. Kings in Nineveh viewed Elam's revival with suspicion and rage. Campaigns launched westward often found Elamite troops waiting on the field. Some battles ended in bloody stalemates, others in victories for one side or the other, but none delivered final resolution. In this contest, Elam proved that it could no longer be dismissed. It was a partner or an enemy to be reckoned with, and Assyria learned to treat it as such. Inside the royal court, power was never simple. Factions competed for influence, succession disputes broke out, and assassinations sometimes cleared the way for new rulers. Yet the very turbulence of the dynasty fed its resilience. When one branch faltered, another stepped forward. Authority was not broken by crisis. It was reshaped and renewed. This constant adjustment allowed Elam to maintain vitality. Even when stability seemed fragile, ordinary people carried on their lives within this shifting world. Farmers sowed seed in fields, watered by restored qanats, their sons marching off to serve in the army when called. Women managed households and estates, some appearing in contracts as landowners and lenders. Children studied under scribes, learning not only Elamite, but also Akkadian, the diplomatic tongue of the day. Families prayed to old gods and knew blending traditions as naturally as rivers joining at their confluence. The resilience of the Neo-Elamite age showed itself most clearly in moments of crisis. When Assyrian armies marched with overwhelming numbers, Elamite cities withdrew into their walls and held out. When fields failed, highland herders supplied food from their flocks. When dynastic disputes spilled blood, new leaders quickly stepped into the vacuum. Each trial that might have broken a weaker realm became, for Elam, a test of endurance passed with scars, but also with lessons. By the mid-7th century BC, Elam's identity had been remade. It was no longer simply the land of the highlands shadowed by Mesopotamia. It was a kingdom defined by centuries of survival, now confident enough to ally with great powers and ambitious enough to challenge them. The Neo-Elamite kings looked westward, not with fear, but with determination, ready to stake their place against Assyria's empire and Babylon's dynasties. Villagers who had once whispered of decline now told new stories around their hearths. They spoke of kings who defied Assyria, of battles where Elamite arrows darkened the sky, of temples crowded with worshippers once more. Children grew up not with tales of loss alone, but with hope that their land could rise again. The revival would not last forever, but in its time it restored dignity and strength to a people who had endured centuries of hardship. Out of drought, invasion, and silence, Elam had returned to life, and in the hills and plains of their homeland, men and women felt again the pulse of a kingdom that refused to die. Assyria's kings never forgot the mountains to their east. Beyond the Tigris lay Elam, a land that had resisted them for centuries, a rival that refused to bow. In the eyes of Nineveh and Ashur, the highland kingdom was a thorn in the flesh of empire, an archer hidden behind ridges, loosing arrows at the plains. To conquer Elam would mean more than another victory. It would mean breaking a neighbor that had outlived every Mesopotamian dynasty before them. The storm began in earnest in 720 BC. Sargon II of Assyria marched against a coalition of Babylonians and Elamites at the city of Der. The field trembled beneath thousands of soldiers, spears bristling like a forest, shields glinting in the harsh sun. Elamite archers raised their bows, sending volleys that turned daylight into a shower of iron. Drums thundered, horns blared, and the crash of chariots echoed across the plain. By sunset, Sargon's proud army reeled back across the river, and the allies claimed victory. In Susa, the news was greeted with feasts and sacrifices. Poets sang of the day when mountain warriors humbled the empire of iron. Der became legend, proof that Elam still had teeth. But Assyria was not finished. Year after year, their armies returned, driven by kings who could not abide defiance. Sennacherib, inheriting the crown, turned his fury on Babylon and its allies. Wherever rebellion rose, Elam's hand was suspected. To the Assyrians, Elam was the hidden hand behind every uprising. To the Babylonians, it was the shield that gave them hope. In 691 BC, the armies met again, this time at Halul. It was said to be one of the greatest battles of the age. Babylonians, Chaldeans, and Elamites gathered in a coalition vast enough to frighten even Nineveh. Their banners fluttered above tens of thousands of men, the riverbank crowded with soldiers waiting for the clash. Sennacherib advanced with his iron legions, disciplined and merciless. The fighting raged from dawn until dusk. Elamite archers loosed arrows in unbroken volleys. Syrian chariots thundered across the plain, and men fell in heaps, trampled into mud thick with blood. Neither side could claim the field. The coalition withdrew, battered but alive, while Sennacherib boasted of victory to his gods. In truth, Halul was a draw, but the cost in lives left scars on both kingdoms. These wars were not fought only by soldiers. Ordinary families bore the worst of it. Assyrian armies destroyed villages suspected of aiding Elam, torching houses and orchards, salting fields, flooding canals. Survivors told of soldiers cutting down fruit trees, leaving stumps where shade and food had once grown. Refugees stumbled into Elamite valleys with little more than what they carried on their backs, their stories filled with terror. Children torn from their parents, rebels impaled outside their own gates, captives driven westward in chains. The land between rivers and mountains became a corridor of misery. Diplomacy was no safer than battle. Assyrian tablets record frantic letters between kings, each side accusing the other of betrayal. Elamite envoys promised armies to Babylon, demanded tribute, and arranged marriages that bound their houses together. Treaties were sworn with oaths before gods, yet they cracked as soon as advantage shifted. Coalitions formed and collapsed, cities changed sides overnight, and the frontier remained a cauldron of suspicion and intrigue. Through all this turmoil, Elamite warriors gained a reputation that echoed far beyond their valleys. Archers from the mountains were prized allies, their arrows feared on every battlefield. Cavalry units darted across plains, striking swiftly before vanishing into the hills. They fought not as mercenaries alone, but as defenders of their homeland, hardened by generations of struggle. Even Assyrian annals, written to magnify their own kings, grudgingly acknowledged Elam's ferocity. By the mid-7th century, the war reached its most brutal chapter. Teuman, king of Elam, stood at the forefront of resistance against Ashurbanipal of Assyria. Proud, defiant, he refused to bend even when Assyria's power seemed unstoppable. In 653 BC, the two armies met at the river Ulai. The clash was decisive. Elam's lines broke under Assyria's assault, and Teuman was slain. Assyrian reliefs carved the scene into stone, his head severed, displayed before the king of Nineveh as a trophy. To the Assyrians, it was victory beyond question. To the Elamites, it was a wound that cut deep into their pride and memory. Yet Elam did not vanish. Ashurbanipal proclaimed the kingdom destroyed, its gods humbled, its lands empty of voices. But within a few years, Elamite kings returned, gathering troops, forging alliances, and raiding across the frontier once more. Like a flame beaten down by wind, Elam flared back after each blow. Susa's streets filled again, temples smoked with offerings, and armies marched once more under the mountain banners. The human cost of this endless war could not be hidden. Fields lay fallow, canals clogged with silt, and orchards rotted, untended. Families lived in fear of the next Assyrian campaign. In highland villages, men built walls around their hamlets. Children learned to sleep lightly. Women whispered prayers to Inshushinak and Pinikir for safety. Traders still led caravans through the valleys, but they traveled under armed escort, eyes always watching the horizon. Even in defeat, the Elamites clung to dignity. Their kings proclaimed resistance in inscriptions. Their priests carried on sacrifices. Their elders told stories of past triumphs to children growing up in an age of fire. In their eyes, survival itself was defiance. To endure against the world's most ruthless empire was victory enough. Assyrian records boast of Elam's destruction again and again, yet the truth lay in the persistence of its people. Each time Assyria marched east, they found resistance waiting. Each time they claimed victory, the kingdom revived. No conquest lasted, no terror erased Elam's will. For a century and more, this struggle defined the fate of the region, binding Elam and Assyria together in hatred, fear, and grim respect. When later generations spoke of this time, they remembered not only victories, but the sheer endurance of a small kingdom against the mightiest empire of its age. They told of Der's triumph, Halul's blood-soaked stalemate, Ulai's catastrophe. They remembered kings who fought to the end, archers who stood their ground, villages that rebuilt after each invasion. They remembered that Elam did not submit, even when every power around it fell silent. The struggle with Assyria was no single war, but a century of defiance, a contest of strength that reshaped both kingdoms. For Assyria, it became a lesson in persistence. For Elam, it became the very heart of its identity. Theirs was not a story of easy victories, but of survival hammered out in fire and blood. A legacy no conqueror could erase. The armies of Assyria moved like thunder across the land. At their head marched Ashurbanipal, king of Nineveh, master of iron hosts, whose empire stretched from Egypt to the mountains of Iran. His reign was bathed in blood and gilded with learning. He was conqueror and scholar alike, ruthless on the field, careful in his libraries. By the mid-7th century BC, his gaze turned east once more, toward the kingdom that had resisted his forefathers for generations. Elam, weary yet unbroken, stood in his path. Years of conflict preceded the final storm. Babylon, ever restless under Assyrian rule, called on Elamite aid. Armies crossed the Tigris, banners of the mountains unfurled beside those of Babylonian rebels. Battles raged along the frontier, sometimes favoring Assyria, sometimes Elam. The war dragged on, draining both sides. But Ashurbanipal was determined to end the struggle. His enemies would not simply be defeated, they would be erased. Campaign after campaign carried Assyrian troops into Elamite valleys. Villages were torched, orchards felled, canals torn open to flood fields. Families fled to the hills with whatever they could carry, watching smoke rise from their homes. Susa itself, ancient city of kings and gods, braced for the storm. Its walls were strengthened, its temples filled with offerings. Its defenders swore oaths before Inshushinak to fight until death. Yet even in their prayers, the people knew the odds were hopeless. In 646 BC, the final blow fell. Ashurbanipal's army encircled Susa, its camps stretching across the horizon. Siege engines rolled into place, their wheels groaning as they were dragged by oxen. Archers lined the fields, their bows drawn taut, while engineers built ramps to scale the walls. For days the assault thundered, stones hurled from slings shattered rooftops, ladders crashed against battlements, and soldiers fought hand to hand on parapets slick with blood. Inside the city, defenders fought with desperate courage, hurling spears and boiling pitch, but the flood of Assyrian iron never ceased. At last, the gates splintered. The enemy poured in, relentless as a tide. Streets that once rang with market cries filled with the screams of battle. Warriors clashed in alleys, mothers clutched children in the shadows. Temples that had stood for centuries echoed with the crash of axes. Statues of gods were toppled, their faces shattered on stone pavements. Flames rose in great pillars, consuming houses and sanctuaries alike. Assyrian chronicles boasted of the devastation. They claimed temples were stripped bare, archives burned, tombs of kings desecrated. Treasures gathered for 15 centuries were carried off in a single season. Even the royal necropolis was plundered. The bones of long-dead rulers were scattered, their resting places defiled. Ashurbanipal himself proclaimed, "I left Elam empty of the sound of human voices." His words dripped with satisfaction, as if silence itself was the proof of conquest. What the conquerors did not carve into stone were the faces of the survivors. Tens of thousands were taken captive, marched in chains across rivers and deserts to Assyria's heartland. Families were torn apart on the road. Elders fell behind and were left to die. Children stumbled in exhaustion. Others were resettled far from their homeland, forced to labor in fields and workshops under foreign masters. Entire districts of Elam fell silent, their people scattered across an empire that thrived on stolen lives. Within Susa, the ruin was complete. Temples that had been tended for centuries lay in ashes. In Shushanak's sanctuary, once bright with offerings, stood blackened and gutted. Streets were littered with corpses, their bodies left for dogs and carrion birds. Fires smoldered for days, until only charred walls and broken statues marked where the city had stood. Travelers who passed through years later spoke of a silence so deep it seemed the gods themselves had fled. For the Assyrians, the destruction of Susa was spectacle as much as strategy. Reliefs carved in Nineveh showed the sack in brutal detail. Soldiers looting, flames consuming palaces, prisoners paraded before the king. These images were propaganda meant to terrify other foes. Anyone who thought to resist Assyria would see Elam's fate and tremble. The fall of Susa was not just conquest, it was theatre of annihilation. And yet, despite the ruin, Elam was not entirely erased. Villages in the mountains endured. Highland fortresses held out. Scattered lords clung to fragments of power. But the beating heart of the kingdom had been torn out. Without Susa, Elam was a body with its chest hollowed, its soul stripped from its temples. The land survived, but the nation, as it had been, was gone. For centuries afterward, poets and chroniclers in Mesopotamia remembered the sack with awe and horror. To Assyrians, it was proof of Ashurbanipal's unmatched might. To Babylonians, it was a warning of what awaited rebels. To later Persians, it was a shadow on the past, a reminder of how kingdoms might fall. And for the Elamites who survived, scattered across foreign lands or clinging to ruined villages, it was grief carried in silence, a memory too painful to name. Ashurbanipal's empire would not endure forever. Assyria itself would fall within a few generations. Its own cities burned, its own palaces toppled. Yet the destruction of Susa marked a turning point in Near Eastern history. An ancient kingdom that had endured since the dawn of civilization was shattered. Its language would linger in scribal hands. Its gods would find echoes in Persian worship. But as an independent power, Elam was finished. In the blackened ruins of Susa, amid the rubble of temples and the bones of kings, silence stretched where hymns and markets once filled the air. That silence was Ashurbanipal's boast, his monument to conquest. But silence does not last forever. Beneath the ashes, survivors endured, and memory endured with them. The fires that consumed Susa left more than ruins. They left an emptiness that echoed across the valleys and plains, a silence where hymns and market cries had once risen. Ashurbanipal had boasted of leaving the land empty of human voices. And though the exaggeration was carved for effect, the devastation was real. The kingdom that had stood for 15 centuries lay broken. Yet even in ruin, life clung stubbornly to the hills, and memory refused to fade. Scattered survivors rebuilt where they could. Villages rose from ash. Farmers returned to fields when rains allowed, and families lit lamps in houses patched from rubble. They no longer dreamed of empire, only of endurance. Still, beneath that quiet surface, fragments of the old identity lingered. People still spoke their language in markets, still whispered prayers to Inshushinak at roadside shrines, still carried cylinder seals engraved with ancient symbols. Defeat had silenced kings, but it had not erased culture. Meanwhile, the political map of the Near East shifted once more. Assyria, triumphant in Elam's destruction, soon discovered that conquest did not guarantee stability. Its campaigns drained treasuries. Its brutality bred resentment, and new enemies gathered at its borders. Within a few decades, the empire itself faltered. Nineveh fell in 612 BC. Its palaces burned in the same way Susa's had been. For those who remembered the sack of Elam's capital, there was a grim symmetry. The destroyer too was destroyed. Into this changing world stepped new powers. The Medes pressed from the northwest, Persians from the south, Babylonians from the west. The once feared Assyrian state dissolved into dust, and the highlands that had nurtured Elam now became part of a wider contest. Amid this shifting balance, the remnants of the old people persisted, absorbed but not erased. Language kept their presence alive. In the 6th century BC, when Cyrus the Great rose to power in Anshan, scribes still wrote in the tongue of the highlands. Administrative tablets at Persepolis, centuries later, would be penned in that same idiom. Though rulers now called themselves kings of Persia, the bureaucratic heartbeat of their empire often spoke in Elamite words. The tongue of a people, thought broken, became the medium of a new dominion. Architecture carried echoes as well. In Persepolis and Susa, columns rose on bases that recalled the temples of the earlier kingdom. Glazed bricks gleamed in colors first mastered at Choga-Zanbil, carried now into the palaces of Darius and Xerxes. Craftsmen from the valleys, heirs to ancient traditions, built the monuments of the Achaemenids. Their skill became part of Persia's grandeur, even if their names were lost to time. Religion, too, revealed threads of continuity. In royal inscriptions of the Persians, old gods appeared beside Ahura Mazda, lingering in faint but clear echoes. The mountain spirits and city guardians of Elam found a place, however small, in the new order. Faith had shifted, transformed by Zoroastrian teachings, yet it carried shadows of earlier devotion. The dead kingdom lived on in liturgy as well as stone. Susa itself rose again. No longer the capital of an independent highland realm, it became one of the royal cities of Persia. Darius I rebuilt it with care, raising palaces and audience halls on its ancient ground. Foreign envoys walked its streets, unaware that beneath their feet lay layers of older walls, the remains of a civilization that had once defied Sargon, Hammurabi, and Ashurbanipal alike. The city that had seemed silenced forever became a stage for empire once more. Even blood carried continuity. Modern studies of ancient DNA confirm what history suggested. The people of the valleys were not replaced, only absorbed. Their descendants became Persians and Medes, their lineages woven into the fabric of new nations. Conquerors took their lands, but the people endured in body and in memory, passing down customs, words, and skills that shaped the future. Cyrus the Great himself claimed descent from Anshan, the highland stronghold of the Elamites. In his proclamations, he styled himself King of Anshan, drawing legitimacy not only from Persian roots, but from the legacy of the land he ruled. Whether he truly traced his bloodline to Elamite dynasties, or merely adopted the title for prestige, the effect was the same. The old kingdom had become part of Persia's royal heritage. By 539 BC, when Cyrus entered Babylon as conqueror, the cycle of history had turned. Elam, the once proud rival of the lowlands, had vanished as a sovereign realm, yet its spirit lived on in the empire that now dominated the known world. From the language of bureaucrats to the skills of craftsmen, from the memories of Anshan to the rebuilt streets of Susa, the influence of Elam pulsed through Persia. Centuries of independence had ended, but centuries of legacy had just begun. When scribes inscribed the Behistun inscription for Darius, they used 3 languages: Old Persian, Akkadian, and Elamite. To place the Highland tongue beside those of conquerors was no accident. It was recognition that Elam had mattered, that its voice had shaped the land even in defeat. In time, the Elamite language fell silent. By the days of Alexander the Great, it had vanished from everyday speech, surviving only in archives. Yet silence is not erasure. The old words live on in thousands of clay tablets, in fragments that scholars still decipher today. Through them, we hear the hum of an ancient administration, the echo of voices thought lost. Thus, the story of Elam closes not with extinction, but with transformation. From farmers sowing fields in the Zagros to kings carrying idols out of Babylon, from builders raising ziggurats to scribes inscribing laws. The people of the highlands shaped the world around them. Their kingdom ended in fire, but their legacy became part of an empire that stretched from the Indus to the Aegean. Elam was gone, yet Persia before Persia, bore its mark in every stone, every tablet, every ritual. The conquerors could burn cities and scatter peoples, but they could not erase memory. From the silence of ruins rose new voices, carrying forward the echoes of the highlands into the heart of empire.